The Earth 30,000 years ago was not the Earth we know. It was colder, wilder, and far less forgiving. The Ice Age wrapped its grip around the planet, sculpting every horizon with glaciers and snow. Mountains were hidden beneath blankets of ice. Valleys were carved deeper by rivers that ran like silver blades, and the plains stretched wide and pale under a sky heavy with frost. Seasons existed, but they were brutal and short-lived. Summers were cool and fleeting, while winters felt endless, dragging on with storms of snow and wind that could strip life from the unprepared. This was the stage upon which both humans and wolves fought to exist. The world belonged to no single species. It was a constant contest of endurance, wit, and adaptation. Herds of mammoth roamed the tundra, moving like living mountains, their tusks curving toward the sky like frozen crescents. Woolly rhinoceroses dragged their massive horns through the frost, searching for grasses buried beneath ice. Steppe bison, wild horses, and reindeer migrated in endless cycles, carving ancient paths across the land. These herds were the lifeblood of the plains, and every predator, every tribe and every pack depended on their rhythm. Predators stalked them endlessly. Cave lions, larger and stronger than any lion alive today, crouched in the grasses, their golden coats rippling as they prepared to spring. Saber-toothed cats moved with terrifying elegance, their long teeth glistening like ivory daggers when they caught the light of the moon. Hyenas prowled in snarling groups, scavengers but also killers in their own right. And then there were the wolves. The wolves of the Pleistocene were not the grey wolves of our modern world. They were more massive, their skulls broader, their jaws built to crush bone and sinew. Their coats were thick against the endless cold, their stamina unmatched. They lived and hunted in tightly bonded packs, their survival tied to cooperation. Together they could bring down prey far larger than themselves, circling, chasing, wearing down their quarry until exhaustion left it helpless. Their howls echoed across the plains, filling the frozen air with voices that could carry for miles, a haunting chorus that spoke of unity, hunger, and power. And beyond them, on those same plains, humans endured. These were not yet the farmers or builders of civilizations, but small tribes of hunter-gatherers. Their lives were fragile, their survival precarious. Each day demanded strength, cunning, and above all, cooperation. They were bound together by family and need, their shelters fragile against the wind, their fires small sparks in a dark and merciless world. A single tribe might number no more than 20 or 30 souls, children clinging to their mothers, hunters sharpening stone blades, elders whispering old wisdom as their breath steamed in the cold. Fire was their heart. It was protection, warmth, and community. Without it, the cold would swallow them. With it, they kept predators at bay, cooked the meat that gave them strength, and told the stories that gave meaning to their lives. The flicker of flame against cave walls turned shadows into ancestors, turned animals into gods, turned memory into myth. Around the fire, the tribe found more than survival. They found identity, but survival was never guaranteed. A single failed hunt could bring starvation. A storm could scatter the tribe or bury their camp in snow. The teeth of predators gleamed always just beyond the firelight. Cave bears lurked in the darkness of caverns. Lions circled the herds they themselves pursued. And wolves, hungry and restless, prowled the edges of human life. At first, the relationship was only rivalry. Wolves and humans competed for the same prey, hunting the same reindeer, stalking the same horses, chasing the same bison. To the humans, wolves were a threat, sharp-toothed scavengers that might steal a kill or worse, attack the weak. To the wolves, humans were strange and dangerous, wielders of fire and tools that pierced skin and bone. And yet, both species recognized something in each other. The humans saw how wolves hunted in packs, how they communicated through subtle signals, how they encircled prey and exhausted it with relentless endurance. It was a mirror of their own hunts, of their own strategies born not from brute force but from intelligence and cooperation. The wolves in turn saw that humans too lived in groups, protected their young, and worked together to bring down prey larger than themselves. They saw fire, they smelled meat, they observed the strange creatures who, though weaker in body, somehow matched them in cunning. Night after night, the wolves lingered near the glow of campfires. Hunger drove them close, the scent of roasted meat, the bones discarded just beyond the firelight. Humans hurled stones, raised their spears, shouted into the dark to drive them away, and still the wolves returned. They did not vanish as bears did, nor keep their distance like lions. They circled, watching, patient, curious. The humans too could not entirely turn away. They listened to the howls that rose across the plains, felt them shiver in their bones. They knew the wolves were dangerous, yet they also sensed something familiar in them. The wolves' loyalty to one another, their tireless endurance, their hunger for survival, it was a reflection of their own lives. This world of ice and fire was a crucible. It tested every living being, shaping their destinies. Many creatures would not survive its trials. Some would vanish forever, their bones left frozen beneath the snow. But those who adapted, those who found new ways to endure, would rise stronger. For wolves and humans alike, the Ice Age was not only a trial but a chance to look beyond rivalry, to glimpse the beginnings of something neither yet understood. In the crackle of firewood, in the glow of embers against the night, the story was waiting. A story of hunger and trust, of competition turned to cooperation, of two species that would come to share not only food and warmth but life itself. For now the wolves watched from the shadows, their eyes glowing like stars beyond the firelight. The humans whispered stories to keep the dark at bay, their voices rising and falling like the howl of the wind. Neither knew what was coming, neither understood the path they had already begun to walk together. The fire burned, the ice pressed down, and in the silence of the frozen plains, destiny lingered, waiting to be claimed. The fire crackled against the frozen night, its orange glow a fragile defiance in a world of shadows. Around it, the tribe huddled close, their faces lit by the flickering flame, their bodies wrapped in furs heavy with frost. Beyond the circle of light, darkness stretched across the tundra like a living ocean, vast and endless. The wind whispered through the plains, carrying with it a sound that had haunted humans since the dawn of memory, the howl of wolves. It began as a distant cry, a single note rising into the frozen air. Then came another and another, until the voices joined together in harmony, a chorus of hunger, of kinship, of warning. The children shivered and pressed themselves closer to their mothers, while the hunters' hands tightened around their spears. Wolves had followed them for days now, their glowing eyes flashing at the edge of vision, their shadows moving just beyond reach. The humans had seen wolves before. They knew them as rivals, as thieves who stole scraps from kills, as predators who might snatch away a straggler if the chance arose. But this was different. This was not a fleeting glimpse of a pack on the hunt, not the echo of distant howls fading into the night. This was persistence. The wolves were not passing through, they were watching. The first encounter came one bitter night, when hunger gnawed at both species with equal ferocity. The tribe had managed to bring down a reindeer, its carcass now roasting over the fire, fat dripping into the flames. The scent carried far across the plains, and the wolves could not resist. One by one, their shapes emerged from the shadows, sleek forms moving with the silence of ghosts. Yellow eyes fixed on the humans, and for a long moment, there was only stillness. The hunters on one side, spears raised, the wolves on the other, muscles coiled. Then a bold wolf stepped forward. Its fur was thick and matted with snow, its ribs faintly visible beneath the coat. It was not the largest, nor the most dominant, but hunger drove it. A low growl rumbled from its throat, a sound as much a warning as a plea. The humans shouted, their voices sharp, their arms flinging stones into the dark. The wolf flinched but did not retreat. Another appeared beside it, then another, until half a dozen stood together at the edge of firelight. The standoff stretched on, tension like ice in the air. Then with a sudden snarl, one wolf darted forward, snapping at the discarded bones lying in the snow. It seized a fragment and fled back into the dark before the hunters could react. The pack followed, their shapes melting once more into shadow. Around the fire, the humans exhaled, relief mingling with unease. They had defended their kill, but the message was clear. The wolves would not be so easily turned away. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. Wherever the tribe moved, the wolves were near. They trailed the hunters at a distance, appearing at dawn like shadows stretched across the snow. At night, their howls surrounded the camp, weaving through the darkness in a circle of sound. The humans grew restless. Some argued they should hunt the wolves, drive them away once and for all. Others whispered that the wolves were spirits, drawn to the fire by something more than hunger. It was during one of these nights that the first true moment of connection occurred. The tribe had eaten well, and scraps of meat and bone lay scattered beyond the firelight. The wolves circled, as always, their eyes gleaming. But this time, instead of throwing stones, one of the hunters, a young man curious and bold, rose and tossed a bone into the dark. It landed with a dull thud on the snow. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a wolf stepped forward, head low, ears flattened. Slowly, cautiously, it approached the offering. Its muscles trembled with tension, ready to flee at the first sign of danger. But the humans stayed still, their fire crackling softly, their eyes fixed on the shape before them. The wolf seized the bone and darted back into the night. The pack erupted in growls and snarls, fighting over the prize, their voices echoing across the plains. The humans watched in silence, their faces unreadable. Something had shifted. It was not peace, not yet, but it was not war either. It was a recognition, a step closer to something neither tribe nor pack could name. As the days turned into weeks, the wolves grew bolder. They lingered longer near the camp, sometimes lying just beyond the reach of the firelight, their shapes barely visible in the dark. The humans grew accustomed to their presence, though not entirely at ease. Children whispered stories about the glowing eyes that watched them sleep. Elders debated whether the wolves were omens of fortune or of doom. Yet when the hunters returned from the plains, tired and bloodied, they could not deny the usefulness of the wolves. The animals scavenged from kills left behind. Yes, but they also drove herds, harried prey, and left trails that the hunters could follow. One morning, as snow fell in a soft curtain over the camp, the hunters tracked a herd of wild horses across the plain. The wolves followed, as they always did, keeping to the edges, their paws leaving faint trails in the frost. As the humans prepared their ambush, they noticed something strange. The wolves did not attack on their own. Instead, they moved in parallel with the hunters, circling the herd, pushing it toward the waiting spears. When the first horse fell, pierced by stone tips, the wolves closed in, but not to fight the humans. They tore at the edges of the herd, scattering the stragglers, ensuring the kill was complete. The hunters returned that evening, with more meat than expected. The wolves fed on scraps, their muzzles red with blood. For the first time, there was no shouting, no stones thrown, no spears raised. The humans and wolves had hunted together, not by design, but by necessity. That night, as the fire burned low and the stars glimmered cold above, the howls of the wolves rose once more. But this time, the humans listened differently. The sound was no longer just a threat. It was a song of the plains, a voice that echoed their own struggle, their own hunger, their own endurance. Around the fire, they spoke quietly of what had happened. Some warned it was dangerous to allow the wolves so close. Others wondered if the spirits had sent them as guardians, as guides in the endless cold. The truth was simpler, yet far more profound. Hunger had brought them together, but something deeper was beginning to grow. Curiosity, recognition, the faintest threads of trust. The wolves had stepped out of the darkness, and the humans had not driven them back. It was the first encounter, the first fragile moment in a relationship that would transform the destiny of both. And though neither tribe nor pack could know it, the world itself had shifted. The wolves did not leave, even after the first scraps were taken. After the first hunts mirrored each other, they remained, always on the edge of the camp, always at the threshold of firelight. The tribe grew accustomed to their presence, though never completely comfortable. Some nights the hunters muttered curses under their breath, clutching their spears tighter as eyes glowed in the dark. Mothers pulled their children closer, warning them not to wander too far. And yet, despite fear, despite caution, the wolves became a constant. At dawn, their howls rose with the first light of the sun, echoing across the tundra. At dusk, their silhouettes lingered against the fading sky. When the hunters set out across the plains, the wolves followed, sometimes close, sometimes far, but always there. They were no longer only rivals, no longer only thieves. They were watchers. It was a strange coexistence, fragile and uncertain. On one side, the humans bound together by fire and language, their days measured by hunts and survival. On the other, the wolves guided by instinct and hunger, their lives shaped by the rhythm of the pack. They circled each other like shadows, neither side fully trusting, yet neither side willing to break the thread that had begun to weave between them. The elders of the tribe debated endlessly. Some argued that wolves were dangerous spirits, drawn to the camp to test them. Others believed the animals carried wisdom, that their howls were voices of the ancestors calling across the plains. A few saw something simpler but more practical. The wolves lingered because food lingered, because scraps remained after feasts, because bones were easier prey than reindeer. But among the younger hunters, curiosity outweighed fear. They began to watch the wolves as closely as the wolves watched them. They studied the way the pack moved together, how they signaled silently with flicks of their tails, with lowered ears, with glances sharper than words. They noticed how the wolves could run for hours, tirelessly chasing prey until exhaustion brought it down. In those lessons, the hunters saw reflections of themselves. One evening, as the tribe settled around their fire after a meager hunt, one of the young men rose. He had noticed a wolf, a pale-furred creature with a scar running across its muzzle that lingered closer than the rest. Its eyes caught the firelight, steady, unafraid. From the edge of the circle, he picked up a bone stripped of meat and tossed it lightly into the snow. The wolf flinched, then lowered its head, sniffing. Slowly, it approached, every step cautious. The tribe watched in silence, breath held. At last, the wolf seized the bone and retreated into the shadows, where growls erupted as the pack tore at the prize. The hunters laughed softly, nervous but exhilarated. It had not been an attack. It had not been a test. It had been an exchange. Night after night, this ritual repeated. Bones tossed into the dark, wolves slinking forward, then retreating. Each time, the gap between fire and tree line seemed to shrink. The wolves, once enemies, had become watchers, and now, tentatively, carefully, they were becoming guests. Still, trust was thin. There were nights when the wolves grew bold, when their hunger outweighed caution. Once, during a bitter storm, a pair lunged too close to the camp, snapping at a hanging hide where strips of meat had been left to dry. The hunters shouted, spears raised, and one wolf was struck, limping back into the snow with a wound. The pack's howls filled the night with rage and sorrow, and for days after, they kept their distance. The tribe murmured that the balance had been broken, that danger would follow, but in time the wolves returned, circling again, watching again. The thread held. The shift from enemies to watchers was not born of kindness, but of necessity. The cold was relentless. The herds moved with the seasons, and both wolves and humans depended on their migrations. To waste food was unthinkable, and yet scraps always remained. For the wolves, the camp became a source of survival. For the humans, the wolves became unintentional guardians. Other predators, lions, hyenas, kept their distance when wolves lingered near. The howls that once filled the tribe with fear now offered a strange comfort, a sign that they were not alone in the vast empty night. And in those howls, something stirred in the hearts of the tribe. The sound was mournful, but also strong. It spoke of kinship, of loyalty, of unity in the face of hunger and cold. The humans heard in it echoes of their own songs, their own calls across the plains. The wolves were no longer just animals. They were voices of the wilderness, speaking in a language different yet familiar. Over time, individual wolves became recognizable. The scar-muzzled wolf returned again and again, always lingering closer, always watching the fire with a gaze that seemed more curious than threatening. A dark-furred female often followed, her coat glistening in the frost, her eyes sharp with intelligence. Children whispered names for them, though never aloud when the elders were near. To name a creature was to invite it into their world, to grant it a place among them. The bond was fragile, easily broken, yet undeniable. The wolves were no longer only enemies, no longer only rivals. They had become watchers, participants in a story neither species had chosen, but both had begun to share. The tribe could not yet imagine what lay ahead. They did not know that these watchers would one day become hunters at their side, companions at their fires, guardians of their children. They did not know that from these cautious exchanges, from these moments of fear and hunger, would grow a bond that would last for millennia. For now they knew only this: the wolves had not left. They had stepped closer to the fire, and the humans had not turned them away. The night stretched on, the fire flickered low, and somewhere in the darkness, beyond the circle of light, a scarred wolf watched with steady eyes, patient, waiting. The bond between wolves and humans did not appear suddenly, as if conjured in a single moment of revelation. It grew slowly, cautiously, like the first cracks in ice that widen with each change of season. At first there was only suspicion, then tolerance, then the faintest flickers of something deeper. In the frozen wilderness of 30,000 years ago, bonds were not formed by sentiment, but by survival. And survival required patience. The tribe had learned over weeks and months that the wolves were no longer only competitors. They had stopped being just enemies. They were no longer a danger to be warded off with stones and shouts alone. The wolves had become something stranger, something harder to define. They were companions of the hunt, shadows in the night, creatures who fed when scraps were thrown, and who followed when the tribe moved across the steppe. They were not kin, not yet, but neither were they entirely other. They were something in between. The humans still feared them, of course. Fear was natural, as much a part of survival as fire or spear. But alongside fear grew familiarity, and familiarity began to dull the sharpness of instinct. The wolves were always there, their yellow eyes glinting from the tree line, their voices rising in the long nights. At first those howls had chilled the tribe with dread, but now they were expected, almost anticipated. When the night was silent, when no wolf song carried across the plain, unease replaced fear. Silence meant absence, and absence was its own kind of threat. It was not just the presence of wolves that changed. The wolves themselves began to change too. Some grew bolder, lingering closer to the fires, creeping nearer to the discarded bones left after meals. One scarred male returned again and again, his muzzle marked by an old wound, his eyes steady and curious. A dark-furred female often followed him, her movements cautious, but her gaze intelligent. These individuals began to be recognized, distinguished from the mass of glowing eyes beyond the firelight. Children whispered about them, inventing secret names, while elders frowned but did not forbid it. Naming a creature was dangerous, yes, but it was also a way of weaving it into the fabric of the tribe's world. The wolves learned as well. They came to understand the limits of the human's tolerance, the invisible line where the firelight ended and the darkness began. They learned that a sudden lunge would bring stones and spears, but a slow, patient approach could bring scraps thrown their way. They learned to wait, to circle, to move when the humans were calm. They learned that the camp was not just a source of food, but also a place of relative safety. Other predators prowled the steppe, lions, hyenas, bears, but they kept their distance when wolves lingered near. This new rhythm became part of life. Each day the hunters set out onto the plains, their spears tipped with sharpened stone, their eyes scanning for herds. And each day, the wolves followed. Sometimes they trailed from afar, shadows against the snow. Other times they drew nearer, weaving parallel paths through the grass and frost. When the humans found prey, the wolves often circled too, harrying the herd, splitting it, driving it toward the hunters' waiting spears. Not every hunt ended in cooperation, but enough did that patterns began to form. One day the tribe tracked a herd of reindeer across the steppe. The animals were swift, their hooves clattering over frozen ground, but the hunters were patient, pacing themselves for the long chase. Hours passed, their breath steaming in the air, their feet crunching over snow, and then without warning the wolves appeared. They streamed across the plain like flowing shadows, their bodies lean, their movements fluid. They flanked the herd, pushing it toward the hunters, forcing the animals to stumble into range. The spears struck, and the kill was made. When the hunters returned to camp, laden with meat, the wolves followed. That night scraps were tossed freely into the dark. The wolves tore at them, their growls mixing with the crackle of fire. The hunters watched, weary but not afraid. Something had shifted again. What had once been rivalry had become something close to partnership. Still, trust was fragile. There were moments of tension, moments when the bond threatened to unravel. Once in the heart of winter, when hunger was sharpest, a desperate wolf lunged too close to the campfire, snapping at a strip of drying meat. The hunters shouted, spears flashing, and the wolf yelped as a stone struck its flank. The pack howled in fury, their cries echoing through the night like a storm. For days they kept their distance, the silence of their absence heavy with foreboding. The tribe feared the bond had been broken, but slowly, cautiously, the wolves returned. Hunger pulled them back, and patience healed what fear had torn. The slow bond deepened not only in the hunts but in the nights. Around the fire, the humans listened to the wolves' songs, their howls rising into the vast sky. The sound no longer carried only threat, it carried meaning, though the humans could not yet name it. It spoke of distance covered, of prey pursued, of bonds held tight in the darkness. It was mournful and strong, echoing their own chants, their own rituals spoken around firelight. The wolves' voices were different, but they resonated with the same truth. Life endured only through unity, and unity was what bound both species to the frozen steppe. The wolves had packs, the humans had tribes. The wolves had loyalty, the humans had kinship. Both had hunger, both had fear, both had fire, though in different forms. For the wolves, fire was instinct, a spark of cooperation that held the pack together. For humans, fire was literal, the flame that warmed and protected them. In each other they recognized reflections of themselves. Children were the first to test the boundaries of this bond. One night as the fire burned low, a small boy crept to the edge of the circle, clutching a bone stripped of marrow. His mother whispered harshly, pulling him back, but the boy broke free and tossed the bone into the dark. A pale wolf emerged, eyes glowing, and seized it. The boy laughed in delight, clapping his hands while the wolf darted back into the shadows. The elders scolded, warning that such recklessness could bring disaster. Yet even as they spoke, they could not deny the spark in the boy's eyes, the spark of curiosity that burned brighter than fear. Season after season, the slow bond grew. The wolves became more than rivals, more than watchers. They became part of the rhythm of the tribe's life, as natural as the herds and the fire. They were not yet kin, not yet companions, but something was forming, something new, something fragile, something powerful. The Ice Age did not relent. Winters remained brutal, summers fleeting. Prey moved in endless cycles, sometimes abundant, sometimes scarce. Hunger gnawed at all living things. But in the shared struggle, wolves and humans began to weave their destinies together. What had started as rivalry was turning into trust, and trust, however fragile, was enough to survive. The scarred wolf still lingered, always near, always watching. The dark-furred female too remained, her presence steady. Together they became familiar figures in the nights of the tribe. They were not tamed, not domesticated, but they were no longer strangers. They were part of the story now, part of the slow bond being written across the frozen plains. Neither species could have known where this path would lead. Neither could have imagined the future in which wolves would sit by fires without fear, in which their descendants would guard human children and follow human hunters, not as rivals but as allies. But the beginnings were here, in the slow bond of hunger, fire, and patience. The night stretched long, the fire crackled low, and the howls rose into the stars. The bond was not yet complete, but it was no longer impossible. The first steps had been taken, and neither wolves nor humans would turn back. The relationship between humans and wolves had reached a new stage. No longer enemies, and no longer only watchers. The wolves had become something else, partners of a kind, though neither species would have thought to use such a word. Their bond was born not of choice but of need, forged in the crucible of hunger and sharpened by the endless demands of survival. Slowly, cautiously, they had begun to hunt together. And it was in those hunts that the bond deepened, shaped by blood, by patience, and by the cold silence of the steppe. The first hunts shared between wolves and humans were clumsy things, accidental rather than intentional. The wolves trailed the herds as they always had, circling and snapping, driving prey into confusion. The humans waited with spears and stone-tipped darts, seizing the moment of panic to strike. Both groups gained from the chaos, both fed from the kill, and both tolerated the other's presence out of necessity. Yet over time, something began to change. What had been coincidence became pattern. What had been tolerance became something like trust. It was winter when the first true shared hunt took place. The snow lay thick upon the ground, and the herds had grown restless, their movements unpredictable. The tribe had gone days without a successful kill, their bellies hollow, their fires small. The wolves too were hungry, their ribs showing beneath their fur, their howls sharp with desperation. Hunger bound them together, hunger drove them closer. The hunters set out at dawn, their breath steaming in the frozen air. They followed the faint tracks of aurochs, massive cattle that roamed the plains in small herds. The wolves appeared soon after, slipping through the snow like shadows. At first the hunters cursed them, fearing they would drive the herd too soon, but the wolves seemed to understand. They did not charge recklessly. Instead they moved in arcs, circling wide, pressing the aurochs slowly toward the waiting hunters. When the moment came, it was chaos. The wolves lunged, snarling, their teeth flashing white. The aurochs bellowed, hooves pounding against the snow. The hunters shouted, their spears thrusting, stone tips biting into flesh. Blood sprayed, steam rising from warm bodies in the frozen air. One aurochs fell, then another. The wolves leapt at the fallen beasts, tearing at flanks and throats, while the hunters struck again to finish the kill. It was brutal, it was bloody, but it was also undeniable. They had hunted together, and they had succeeded. That night, the tribe feasted, meat roasted over the fire, fat dripping into the flames. The wolves lingered at the edge of the camp, their eyes glowing, their bodies tense. But when bones and scraps were thrown their way, they did not dart back into the dark as before. They stayed close, gnawing and growling, their muzzles red with blood. For the first time humans and wolves ate side by side, separated by only a few paces of firelit snow. From that hunt onward, the bond grew stronger. Again and again, wolves and humans found themselves chasing the same prey, and again, they succeeded together. Sometimes the wolves drove the herds toward the hunters, sometimes the hunters pushed prey into the wolves' waiting jaws. It was not coordination in the sense humans knew, but it was cooperation nonetheless. Each learned to read the other's movements, each learned to anticipate what came next. Slowly a rhythm emerged, a rhythm of the shared hunt. The hunters began to notice something else as well. Not all wolves were the same. Some hung back, snarling and snapping only after the kill. Others grew bolder, running closer to the humans, watching them with eyes that seemed to measure and to learn. A few even began to linger after the hunts, not returning immediately to the pack. They lay near the camp, their ears twitching at every sound, their bodies half in shadow, half in light. These were the wolves who began to change, the ones who edged closer to becoming more than wild. There was risk, of course. Not all hunts ended in unity. Once during a desperate chase of a massive bison, the wolves grew impatient, lunging too early. The herd scattered, the bison escaped, and the hunters returned empty-handed. The tribe raged, their stomachs hollow, their anger sharp. Spears were raised against the wolves, stones hurled in fury. The wolves fled into the dark, their howls bitter, and for many days the fragile bond seemed broken. But hunger does not forgive pride. The next hunt, the wolves returned, and the pattern began again. One evening, after a long day's chase, the hunters returned with 2 reindeer. The wolves had harried the herd, snapping at the flanks, keeping the prey moving until exhaustion dragged them down. The hunters had finished the kill, but they knew well that without the wolves, the chase might have failed. As they cut the carcasses, one of the elders spoke quietly. "They are no longer only rivals," he said. "They are hunters, as we are. They are brothers of the chase." The words carried weight. The tribe began to speak of wolves differently. They were no longer only spirits of fear, no longer only thieves of meat. They were allies, dangerous allies, yes, but allies nonetheless. Around the fire, the children watched the wolves with wide eyes. They whispered stories of the scarred wolf and the dark-furred female, tales of how they had guided the hunters, of how they had guided the hunters, of how they had sung to the moon to call the herds. Stories grew as naturally as fire spreads, and with them grew the idea that wolves were part of their world, part of their survival, part of their story. As seasons passed, the shared hunts became more frequent. Wolves learned to shadow the hunters at a closer distance, their movements aligning almost naturally. Humans learned to tolerate their presence, to read their signals, to follow when the wolves scented prey. Step by step, hunt by hunt, the bond deepened, until it seemed almost inevitable. Neither tribe nor pack could have named it then, but this was the beginning of something that would reshape the world. The shared hunt was not only survival, it was evolution. It was the moment when 2 species, separated by instinct and by fear, began to walk the same path. And in the quiet of the night, when the fires burned low and the wolves lay in the snow just beyond the circle of light, the hunters listened to their howls with new ears. The sound was no longer only hunger, no longer only warning. It was kinship. It was the voice of allies. It was the song of the shared hunt. The fire had always been the boundary. For humans, it was warmth, safety, and light. For wolves, it was mystery, danger, and an invisible wall they dared not cross. Flames meant heat and smoke, scents that clung to hides and hair. For tens of thousands of years, the fire kept the two species apart, each circling the other, bound by necessity yet divided by fear. But as hunts grew more frequent, as scraps were tossed and bonds grew stronger, the line began to blur. Slowly, cautiously, some wolves began to linger closer to the fire. At first, they stayed at the edges of the shadows, their eyes glowing like coals. Then, a few daring ones stepped into the half-light, their paws crunching softly on frost, their breath steaming in the night. They sat, not close enough to threaten, not close enough to claim, but near enough that their presence was undeniable. The humans watched them warily. Spears rested within arm's reach. Stones lay ready by the fire. Mothers clutched their children close, whispering old warnings, but the wolves did not lunge. They did not growl or bare their teeth. They sat, tails curled, ears pricked, watching the humans as the humans watched them. It was an uneasy truce, a fragile moment of stillness in a world that rarely allowed such peace. The scarred wolf was among the first. His pale coat caught the firelight, his muzzle marked by an old wound, his eyes steady and unflinching. He lingered longer than the others, returning night after night, always settling at the same distance, as if measuring the invisible line he dared not cross. The dark-furred female often followed, her coat glistening with frost, her gaze sharp and intelligent. Together they became familiar figures at the edge of the firelight, no longer shadows but presences, acknowledged by the tribe if not yet welcomed. One evening, after a particularly harsh hunt, the tribe gathered around the fire to roast strips of reindeer. The air was heavy with the scent of meat, fat dripping into the flames, sparks rising into the frozen sky. The wolves lingered nearby, their hunger obvious, their bodies tense. A child, bold with curiosity, picked up a scrap of meat and tossed it toward the scarred wolf. The piece landed in the snow between firelight and shadow. The wolf hesitated, his ears twitching, his body taut as a bowstring. Slowly he stepped forward. Step by step, he entered the half-light, his fur glowing orange in the flames. He seized the scrap, retreated and devoured it. The tribe exhaled as one, a breath they had not realized they were holding. No attack had come, no violence, only hunger answered. The elders murmured uneasily, warning that such boldness could invite danger. Yet in their voices was not only fear but wonder. The fire had been crossed, if not fully, then in part. A boundary had shifted. Over the weeks that followed, the wolves drew nearer. They no longer waited in the shadows, they sat openly at the edge of the firelight, their bodies outlined against the snow, their eyes fixed on the humans. The tribe grew used to their presence, though never entirely comfortable. At times a wolf's sudden movement sent hands scrambling for spears. At times growls rippled through the pack, and the hunters rose to their feet in warning. But violence rarely came. Instead, night after night, wolves and humans shared the same circle of light, separated by only a few paces of snow. The children were the boldest. They tossed scraps into the dark, giggling as the wolves darted forward. Some even crawled closer, their mothers pulling them back with sharp whispers. To the children, the wolves were not spirits of fear but creatures of fascination. They saw in them not only danger, but kinship, eyes that glowed like their own, voices that rose into the night like their own songs. The wolves became part of their world, part of their stories. The hunters too began to see value. Wolves near the camp meant safety. Other predators kept their distance when wolves lingered nearby. Lions prowled the steppe, their roars echoing through the night, but they did not challenge a camp guarded by wolves. Hyenas laughed in the distance, but they did not draw near. The wolves' presence was a shield, an unspoken protection. The tribe learned to listen for their howls not with dread, but with relief. A camp without wolves was a camp exposed. It was during one of the longest nights of winter that the bond deepened further. A storm howled across the plains, winds shrieking like spirits, snow driving hard against the shelters. The fire sputtered, the tribe huddled close, their mammoth bone huts creaking under the weight of snow. Outside, shapes moved in the blizzard, wolves drawn close not by scraps but by need. The scarred wolf appeared first, his pale form barely visible against the storm. He crouched near the fire, shivering, his fur whipped by wind. One by one others followed, until a circle of wolves ringed the camp, their bodies pressed against the snow, their eyes blinking against the storm. The tribe tensed, fear sharp in their throats. But no attack came. The wolves did not snarl, did not lunge. They simply endured, sharing the warmth of the fire's glow, their bodies hunched against the coal. The humans and wolves shivered together, united not by trust, not by choice, but by survival. In the howl of the storm, boundaries dissolved. Firelight companions had been born. When the storm passed, the wolves slipped back into the shadows, but something had changed. They had sat together through the night, sharing warmth, sharing space. The memory lingered, unspoken but undeniable. The fire was no longer a barrier, it had become a bridge. Over time, certain wolves became fixtures of the camp. The scarred male and the dark-furred female returned again and again, often bringing with them younger wolves, curious and bold. Some of these lingered longer, even sleeping near the outskirts of the shelters. They were not tame. Any sudden movement still sent them bristling, teeth bared, but they were not fully wild either. They belonged to the shadows and the light, straddling both worlds. The hunters began to notice their usefulness in new ways. Wolves were keen-eyed, their senses sharper than any humans. At night, they growled at unseen dangers, their ears pricked at sounds beyond human hearing. They warned of predators, of strangers, of approaching herds. They were guardians as well as hunters, and though the tribe did not yet call them such, the truth was clear. The wolves had become companions of fire, allies of survival. There were still moments of danger, of course. Once a young hunter grew reckless, reaching too close to a wolf that lingered by the fire. The animal snarled, snapping at his hand, and the camp erupted in shouts. Spears were raised, stones were lifted, but the scarred wolf stepped between. He growled low, steady, his gaze fixed on the others. Slowly the pack retreated, leaving the hunter shaken but alive. The elders murmured of omens, of strange new laws of nature being written before their eyes. And indeed something was being written, something ancient and unprecedented. The wolves were no longer only scavengers, no longer only hunters. They were companions of the fire, beings who chose, night after night, to linger in the light, rather than vanish into the dark. And the humans, for all their fear, for all their caution, had allowed it. The children began to invent new stories. They whispered of wolves as guardians sent by the ancestors, of spirits who walked on four legs but spoke in howls. They imagined that the scarred wolf was a leader among both species, a creature who bridged the worlds of man and beast. Around the fire, their eyes wide with wonder, they spun tales of loyalty, of courage, of bonds that could not be broken. The elders frowned at such stories, warning that wolves were still wild, still dangerous. Yet even they could not deny the evidence before their eyes. The wolves were changing. The humans were changing too. Together they were creating something new. As seasons passed, the bond grew deeper. Wolves joined hunts more readily, circling prey with precision that seemed almost planned. Humans learned to trust their signals, to follow their leads, to strike when the wolves drove animals into their path. Around the fire, scraps were shared more freely, bones tossed without hesitation. Some wolves even accepted food from human hands, their teeth brushing against skin without drawing blood. Each small act built upon the last, layer upon layer, until the bond was no longer fragile but firm. The scarred wolf grew older, his fur graying, his movements slower, but his presence never wavered. Night after night, he lingered by the fire, his eyes glowing steady. The dark-furred female remained by his side, her coat glistening with frost, her gaze sharp as ever. Together they embodied the bond, symbols of a new world being born. The tribe could not yet imagine the future. They could not know that these firelight companions would one day become true kin, their descendants sleeping within shelters, guarding children, hunting not alongside but as part of the tribe. But they felt the shift in their bones, in their hearts. Something ancient was ending, and something new was beginning. The fire crackled low, the night stretched long, and the wolves lay close, their breath steaming in the cold. Companions of the fire, companions of survival, companions of fate. The bond was no longer fragile, it was becoming unbreakable. The bond had begun with hunger and necessity, but now it was transforming into something far deeper. No longer were wolves and humans, simply companions of fire or rivals of the hunt. They were becoming companions of life itself. The wolves lingered not just at the edge of camps, not only at moments of hunger, but through every rhythm of daily existence. Slowly, they were weaving themselves into the tapestry of human life, and humans, though cautious, were allowing the threads to remain. The change was not sudden, it was subtle, unfolding over countless nights and endless migrations across the Ice Age steppe. Wolves began to follow the tribe more faithfully, their paw prints mingling with the footprints of men, women, and children. They padded silently alongside the trails, slipping into the trees when danger approached, reappearing at night by the fire. At first they kept their distance, but with each season that distance shrank. The line between their world and our world blurred, until they were walking shared paths. Hunters began to notice their value in more ways than one. The wolves' senses were keener, their eyes sharper in the dark, their noses able to trace scents invisible to human understanding. When the tribe moved across unfamiliar lands, wolves padded ahead, ears twitching, noses low, guiding them away from danger. When herds were near, wolves stiffened, growling softly, their bodies betraying what their voices did not say. And when predators prowled too close, wolves barked and snarled, waking the camp before disaster struck. They were no longer only hunters, they had become guardians. It was during one such migration, across a valley dense with fog, that the tribe first realized how indispensable their companions had become. The mist lay thick over the land, veiling the ground in pale white, hiding hollows and ravines. The tribe moved slowly, their burdens heavy, children clinging to their mothers' legs. Then a growl rose from the front. The scarred wolf, now limping slightly with age, bristled, his teeth bared. The dark-furred female circled him, her hackles raised. The hunters froze, spears lifted. Through the fog a shape moved, massive, hulking, the silhouette of a cave bear. The wolves leapt before the humans even shouted. Their snarls split the mist, their bodies lunged with reckless courage. The bear roared, rising on its hind legs, its shadow towering. But the wolves harried it from all sides, snapping at its flanks, darting in and out. The hunters rushed forward, spears thrusting, their cries rising into the fog. Blood sprayed, the bear roared again, then staggered, collapsing into the mist. Silence fell, broken only by the panting of wolves and men alike. The tribe gathered around the fallen beast, their hearts racing. The hunters looked at one another, then at the wolves, who stood panting, their muzzles red. There was no denying it now. Without the wolves, they might have been crushed, their children slaughtered, their journey ended. The wolves had not only joined the hunt, they had defended the tribe itself. From that day forward, their role grew even clearer. Wolves walked at the edges of the camp, not as scavengers but as sentinels. They barked at the approach of predators, growled at strangers, and watched over the children with eyes sharp and steady. Mothers, once fearful, began to relax when wolves lingered nearby. Children laughed and played, tossing bones and scraps, their games weaving wolves into the heart of their days. Slowly, uneasily, wolves became more than outsiders. They became part of the tribe's rhythm, part of its life. The scarred wolf grew old, his muzzle graying, his limp more pronounced, yet his eyes still gleamed with fire, his presence commanding respect. The dark-furred female stayed ever at his side, her body lean and strong, her movements fluid. Together, they embodied the strange new partnership, half wild, half kin, symbols of a bond no ancestor could have imagined. As the years passed, their offspring began to linger near the tribe as well. Younger wolves, born in the shadows of firelight, grew accustomed to the scent of humans, to the crackle of flames, to the rhythm of songs and chants. These wolves did not flee at sudden movement, did not bare their teeth at every approach. They were cautious, yes, but they were not afraid. For them, humans were not only rivals or strangers, they were part of the world they had always known. And so a cycle began. With each generation, wolves grew more familiar, more comfortable, more intertwined with human life. The tribe too began to accept them not only as guests but as companions. They began to leave scraps deliberately, to carve bones in ways easier for wolves to gnaw. They began to call to them at night, low whistles and soft words, testing the boundaries of trust. Some wolves responded, their ears twitching, their bodies edging closer. What had begun as survival was becoming relationship. One evening, As the fire burned low, a child fell asleep on the snow's edge, his small body curled against the cold. His mother, weary, did not notice until she heard a murmur from the others. There beside the boy, the dark-furred female had settled, her body curled protectively around him. The child slept on, his small hand resting on her fur, his breath mingling with hers in the cold night air. The mother gasped, rushing forward, but the elders stopped her. "Do not break this moment," they whispered, and so she waited, trembling, as the boy and the wolf dreamed side by side beneath the stars. When dawn came, the child stirred, his eyes blinking in wonder. He rose and ran to his mother, laughing, while the wolf shook the snow from her coat and padded back into the shadows. The story spread through the tribe, whispered in awe. It was a sign, they said, a message from the spirits. Wolves were no longer only allies, they were protectors. The bond grew stronger, in ritual as well as in life. The tribe's shamans, who spoke to spirits and read the signs of earth and sky, began to weave wolves into their chants. They painted their images on cave walls, not only as hunters but as guardians, their forms outlined in ochre and charcoal. They carved their shapes into bone, etched them into antler, sang their voices into night. To honor wolves was to honor survival, to honor strength, to honor the shared path of life itself. But with closeness came new challenges. Not all wolves were gentle, not all moments peaceful. There were times when hunger sharpened their teeth, when a careless move sent them snarling. Once, a wolf snatched a strip of meat from a hunter's hand, its jaws snapping too close. Anger flared, spears lifted, but the scarred wolf growled low, his body stiff, his gaze commanding. The others stilled, their rage quelled by his presence. Slowly the young wolf retreated, chastened, his tail low. The tribe realized then that wolves too had laws, hierarchies, leaders who enforced order. They were not only animals but societies, reflections of their own tribes. In the wolves' discipline, they saw a mirror of their own. Respect the leader, follow the rules, and the pack endured. Defy and chaos reigned. This recognition deepened their understanding, their respect, their bond. As seasons passed, humans and wolves became inseparable. The tribe moved, and the wolves followed. The wolves hunted, and the humans joined. Around firelight, both rested, their breaths steaming in the same cold air. Children grew up knowing wolves not as distant shadows but as companions. Hunters grew old with wolves by their side, their lives intertwined until death. And though no one could name it then, something extraordinary was unfolding. Evolution was not only a matter of bones and blood, but of relationships, of bonds forged across species. Wolves were changing, and humans were changing with them. Their fates, once separate, were now one. The howls that rose at night no longer spoke only of wilderness. They spoke of belonging. They spoke of shared lives and shared paths. They spoke of a future neither species could imagine, a future where wolves would no longer be wolves, and humans would no longer walk alone. The snow had melted into rivers, the grasslands spread wide and green, and the herds returned to the valleys. With the turning of seasons came another change, subtle yet immense. Wolves were no longer shadows at the edge of firelight. They were becoming something more, their presence woven into the very fabric of human life. The shared hunts, the shared nights, the shared paths, all had led here, to a point where wolves were no longer fully wild, and humans were no longer entirely alone. The transformation was not dramatic, not sudden. It was the slow erosion of boundaries, worn down by trust, by repetition, by necessity. Each hunt, each winter storm, each scrap of meat tossed across the snow had chipped away at the distance between the two species. And now there were wolves who no longer left at dawn, who no longer melted into the wilderness when the tribe moved. They followed, step by step, paw prints beside footprints, shadows becoming companions. The scarred wolf was old now, his coat patchy, his steps heavy. Yet he still walked with the tribe, his presence steady, his gaze unyielding. The dark-furred female remained ever at his side, strong and sleek, her eyes sharp as flint. Their offspring had grown bold, lingering close to the shelters, sniffing at human hands, padding through camps as if they belonged. It was these younger wolves who marked the shift most clearly. Born into firelight, raised among scraps and songs, They had never known a world where humans were only enemies. To them, humans were simply part of life, strange two-legged kin who offered food, warmth, and protection. One evening, as the sun sank over the plains, a young wolf stretched in the glow of the fire. His coat was mottled gray, his eyes bright with curiosity. He nosed at a bone discarded by the hunters, then, hesitant, cautious, dragged it into the circle of light. No one drove him away. The hunters watched, muttering uneasily, but they did not throw stones. The children laughed softly, their eyes shining as the wolf gnawed on the bone beside them. It was a small moment, a quiet one, yet it was also revolutionary. For the first time, a wolf had lain in the heart of a human camp, not as intruder, not as rival, but as part of it. From that day forward, the boundaries dissolved further. More young wolves lingered within the camps, curling near shelters at night, watching with keen eyes as humans moved through their days. They barked when predators approached, warning the tribe before danger struck. They followed hunters at dawn, not only to scavenge but to guide, their noses leading toward herds, their ears catching the distant rumble of hoofs. They became partners not only in survival but in rhythm, in routine. Hunters began to rely on them. They spoke of wolves with respect, with words once reserved for allies. "The gray one finds the herd before we do," one said. "The black female guards the children better than a spear." Their roles were no longer accidental, they were deliberate. Wolves had become necessary. The shamans, too, wove them into ritual. In the flickering firelight of caves, they painted wolves alongside humans, not only as hunters, not only as predators, but as kin. They traced paw prints in ochre, drew wolves sitting by fires, carved their shapes into bone amulets. They sang of wolves as guardians, as guides, as brothers of the path. The stories of children sleeping beside wolves spread from camp to camp, told and retold until they became legend. But legends alone did not explain the truth. Something deeper was happening, something beyond stories. Wolves themselves were changing. The boldest, the friendliest, the most tolerant of human presence survived more easily. They fed more, they lived longer, they passed on their traits to their pups. With each generation, wolves that stayed closer to humans thrived, while those who kept too much distance struggled. Unknowingly, humans were shaping them, guiding their future, and unknowingly, wolves were shaping humans in return. The hunters grew more attentive, more willing to share, more attuned to the signals of their companions. They began to plan hunts not only around herds, but around the movements of wolves. They learned to whistle softly, to gesture, to speak words that wolves seemed to understand. It was not language as humans knew it, but it was communication, a bridge across the silence. And with each passing season, the bridge grew stronger. There were still moments of tension. Once during a famine, a wolf lunged for a strip of meat still in a woman's hands. She screamed, spears were lifted, blood was nearly spilled, but the scarred wolf, old and weary though he was, intervened. He growled low, steady, his gaze commanding. The young wolf froze, tail tucked, and retreated. The tribe lowered their spears, their hearts pounding. Balance restored. The wolves' own laws, their hierarchies and order, had spared bloodshed once again. The children no longer feared them. They played at the edge of camp, chasing each other with howls, pretending to be wolves. They pressed their small hands into snow beside paw prints, marveling at how alike they seemed. They fed scraps from their palms, laughing as rough tongues brushed their skin. To them, wolves were not monsters, they were family. One night, a new story was born. A child, lost in the forest, was found hours later with a wolf at his side. The boy sobbed as he was carried back, pointing to the animal that had stayed with him, guarding him. The tribe watched in awe as the wolf lingered at the edge of the firelight, eyes glowing steady, before melting into the night. "They are not only hunters," the elders whispered, "they are protectors of our young." From then on, the trust grew deeper. The scarred wolf eventually passed, his body frail, his steps faltering. The tribe mourned, whispering stories of his courage, his leadership, his long companionship. They left offerings on the snow, bones, meat, even carved stones etched with his likeness. The dark-furred female howled for him, her voice rising into the night, a song of grief that echoed across the plains. The humans listened in silence, some weeping, some lifting their voices to join the howl. For the first time, humans and wolves mourned together. The young wolves who remained stepped forward, filling the void. They no longer lingered only at the edges. They lay beside the shelters, barked when strangers approached, guided hunts with ease. Their presence was no longer tolerated, it was expected. The tribe did not merely allow wolves, they relied on them. Thus the path toward domestication began, not with chains, not with cages, not with force, but with fire, with food, with time, with trust. Wolves became companions, not through domination, but through choice. They chose to stay, and humans chose to let them. Together they reshaped each other's futures. The campfires of that age burned on snow and stone, but their light reached far beyond. In their glow, wolves became something new, and humans did as well. They were no longer only two species surviving side by side. They were becoming partners in destiny, and the bond they forged would endure, not for years, not for centuries, but for millennia, until wolves were no longer wolves, and humans no longer walked the earth without dogs by their side. The winds of the Ice Age still swept across the plains, cold and merciless, but something in the world had begun to soften. Not the climate, not yet. Not the endless struggle for food or fire, but within the fragile circle of humanity, within the watchful eyes of the wolves who lingered at its edge, a change was taking root. What had started with hunger, sharpened by the rhythm of shared hunts, deepened by the warmth of firelight and the loyalty of guardianship, had now reached a threshold. Wolves were no longer only shadows or allies. They were becoming something else, something new, creatures that belonged neither fully to the wilderness nor entirely to the tribe. They were the first dogs, though no human of that time could have spoken the word, and no wolf yet knew what it meant. It began with the young. The pups of wolves born near the firelight grew bold faster than their wild kin. They learned early the sounds of laughter, the crackle of fire, the smell of roasted meat. Their eyes, still clouded blue, reflected sparks as they peered curiously at children who tossed bones their way. At first, the distance was wide. Pups would snatch scraps and dart back into the safety of the dark. But hunger and habit drew them closer each night. Soon they no longer fled when children giggled or clapped, no longer bared their teeth at every sudden movement. They lingered, watching, waiting, learning. One winter evening, a boy not yet grown sat near the flames, carving a small figure of bone. A pup, its fur mottled gray and white, crept close, nose twitching. The boy held out the carving, not as food but as gift. The pup sniffed, then nudged the boy's hand. A laugh burst from his lips, and in that sound, the boundary between species bent once more. The elders watched with wary eyes, whispering among themselves, but none intervened, for in their hearts they knew this was not a threat. This was the beginning of something extraordinary. The pups grew with the tribe. They followed the hunters, though they did not yet understand the chase. They barked clumsily at owls, startling the camp, and wrestled with each other in the snow as children shouted in delight. They were not yet wolves, not yet dogs, but something in between, suspended in the delicate space of transformation. It was during a great migration that their value became undeniable. The tribe crossed rivers swollen with meltwater, trudged through mud that clung heavy to their legs, climbed ridges where winds cut like blades. Hunger pressed at them, for herds were scarce and prey quick. One night, as they camped on the edge of a dark forest, the pups, now half-grown, began to bark. It was not the high-pitched play of youth, but a frantic, insistent warning. Hunters rose, spears in hand, and from the tree line came the low growls of predators, hyenas, lean and gaunt, their eyes gleaming in the firelight. The wolves of old might have growled and lunged as well, but these young ones did more. They circled the camp, their barks sharp, their bodies braced between the humans and the forest. They were still small, still clumsy, but their courage was fierce. The hunters rushed forward, spears thrusting, voices raised, and together, man and wolf, they drove the hyenas back into the night. When dawn came, the tribe did not speak of wolves as outsiders. They spoke of guardians, of kin. The pups had saved them, not by instinct alone but by choosing, by standing within the circle of fire instead of outside it. And that choice marked a turning point. The elders began to tolerate them more. The mothers no longer flinched when pups drew near the children, and the hunters began to whistle softly, to coax them along the trails. The pups learned the sounds, the gestures, the the rhythm of human life. They trotted ahead on journeys, sniffing the ground, their tails wagging with a joy no wolf had ever shown. They yipped at strangers, barked at prey, curled beside shelters when storms raged. They were no longer simply tolerated, they were wanted. Seasons passed, and with them the bond grew thicker. The old scarred wolf was long gone, his howl remembered only in stories. The dark-furred female lingered still, older now, her muzzle streaked with grey. She watched the young ones carefully, guiding them, teaching them as she had taught her wild kin. But even she seemed changed, her body at ease within the glow of firelight, her eyes softer when they lingered on the children. One evening, a child who had just begun to walk toddled toward her, unsteady on the snow. Gasps rose, hands moved to pull the child back. But the dark-furred female lowered herself, lying still as stone, her head resting on her paws. The child placed a tiny hand upon her fur, laughed, and leaned against her side. A murmur spread through the camp, a sound of awe. The elders bowed their heads. This was no longer simply alliance, this was trust. The pups grew into wolves, yet not wolves as they had been before. Their bodies were leaner, their coats thicker in some, softer in others, their temperaments gentler, their eyes more patient. They still howled to the moon, still chased one another through snow and grass, but they returned always to the camp, always to the fire. They belonged to two worlds and yet to neither, and in that belonging, something new was born. Hunters began to notice their talents. One wolf scented prey long before the hunters themselves did, its nose twitching, body tense. Another barked sharply when strangers approached, never failing to warn. A third stayed close to the children, growling when they wandered too far. Each had a role, a gift, a presence that the tribe began to value as deeply as spears or fire. They were not tools, they were companions. The shamans, too, marked the change. In their caves they painted not just wolves, but wolves beside humans, wolves seated by fire, wolves walking at the front of the hunt. They traced paw prints beside footprints, symbols of a shared journey. They whispered in chants that wolves were no longer only spirits of wilderness, but spirits of the hearth, guardians of paths, protectors of kin. Still, the transformation was fragile. Not every wolf pup stayed. Some grew wild, returning to the forests and plains. Some grew too bold, snapping at humans, and were driven away. Some grew sick and died, their loss mourned with quiet sorrow. But those who stayed, those who chose fire over shadow, grew ever more different from their kin. They barked more often than they howled, wagged tails more than they bared teeth, lingered at the edges of sleep instead of melting into the dark. And the humans changed with them. Hunters who once cursed wolves now whistled for them at dawn. Children who once feared glowing eyes now reached for soft fur. Mothers who once guarded their children fiercely now watched as pups lay curled at their side. The bond was not only of survival, but of love, of affection, of something humans had never known with another creature. One night, as snow fell heavy, a child cried in the dark. His mother reached for him, but before she could, one of the young wolves padded close, curling against the child's small body. The crying ceased. The mother watched, her heart trembling, as her child slept soundly with the wolf's warmth pressed to him. She did not pull him away. She whispered thanks to the spirits, and let them dream together. The word dog did not exist. The concept of pet had not yet been born. But in that moment, in countless moments like it, the foundation was laid. Wolves were becoming more than wolves. They were becoming the first dogs. And though the people of that age could not yet name it, they felt it in their bones, in their songs, in the steady gaze of eyes that glowed in the firelight. A new chapter of the human story had begun, one that would stretch not only across seasons or generations, but across all of history. The long winters came and went, carving their marks upon both people and wolves. The land shifted slowly, as glaciers groaned, and rivers carved their endless paths through stone. Herds rose and fell, tribes scattered and reunited, children grew into hunters and hunters into elders. Yet through all these cycles, through all the silent passing of generations, one thread remained constant, the steady presence of wolves at the edge of the fire, wolves who were no longer quite wolves, and humans who were no longer quite alone. The pups of yesterday had grown into something different, something neither tribe nor wilderness had ever seen before. Their eyes still gleamed with wildness, but their paws carried them toward the warmth of fire without hesitation. Their voices, once only howls, now cracked into barks, sharp and eager, announcing dangers, welcoming hunters, calling children to play. And their hearts, though born of wilderness, now beat in rhythm with human lives. It was no longer a question of whether wolves belonged within the camp. It was understood. As much as the embers were raked at dawn, as much as meat was dried and stones sharpened, so too were the wolves fed, named, and remembered. They were not guests, not intruders, but companions, woven into the pattern of survival. One spring, as rivers overflowed with meltwater and the plains shimmered green, the hunters pursued a herd of reindeer across the valley. The wolves raced ahead, lean bodies flowing over grass, their noses leading the way. Hunters followed, guided not by stars or memory alone, but by the keen instincts of their companions. When the spears struck true and the herd scattered, the wolves did not vanish into the frenzy to claim the spoils. Instead they circled, snapping at stragglers, driving them toward hunters' paths. They had become partners in the chase, shaping the hunt itself. That night the fire burned bright, the smell of roasted meat rising into the sky. Wolves lay among the hunters, bellies full, paws stretched toward the warmth. A child pressed her head against a mottled coat, her small fingers tangled in fur. An elder, his beard white with years, reached to scratch behind the ears of the scarred grey male who had led the hunt. No one spoke of it as strange. No one saw it as new. It simply was. In time, the bond carried into ritual. The shamans, who once painted wolves as spirits of the hunt, now painted them as guardians of hearth and kin. On cave walls, paw prints intertwined with handprints, not above or below but side by side. Songs were sung in which wolves guided souls through darkness, leading them safely to the other side. They were no longer just symbols of wild strength. They were symbols of loyalty, of guardianship, of love. The transformation was not only in spirit, but in form. Some wolves grew smaller, their limbs compact, their faces softer. Others grew larger, shoulders broad, chests deep, built for endurance beside the march of hunters. Their coats varied, streaked with pale grays, deep blacks, rich reds. No longer a single shape, no longer a single voice. They began to diverge, their paths splitting from those of their wild kin. Still, traces of wildness remained. On cold nights they lifted their heads to the moon and howled, their voices rising with the wind, echoing across valleys and ridges. Yet even then, their howls were joined by whistles, by laughter, by human voices, a chorus of species, bound by fire. One night a story was told that spread from camp to camp, from valley to valley. A child had wandered too far into the dark, the shadows alive with unseen dangers, but when the hunters found him at dawn, he was not alone. A young wolf had lain across him through the night, keeping him warm, snarling at predators that had circled near. The boy lived, and the wolf lived, and together they returned to the firelight. From then on, wolves were not only guardians of the hunt or the night, they were guardians of children, guardians of life itself. Generations turned. Wolves who lingered in shadow were forgotten. Wolves who stayed in light lived on, passing their traits to pups, shaping themselves through the silent hand of human choice. Each pup born closer to firelight, each one gentler, bolder, quicker to listen, and each human more willing to share, more willing to trust, more willing to call a wolf not enemy, not spirit, but friend. The scarred wolves of old became memory, their deeds turned to legend, their names whispered in firelit tales. But their descendants, the first dogs, lived not in legend but in flesh, their paws pressed into snow beside human footprints, their eyes reflecting the flames of hearths that would one day become villages, and then cities. They had crossed the threshold. Wolves had chosen the fire, and humans had chosen the wolves. Together they had reshaped the very path of history, and none of those first tribes could have known it, though no child or elder or hunter could have imagined. The bond they forged would carry forward across millennia, through forests and deserts, across mountains and seas, through empires risen and fallen. Dogs would follow humans, and humans would never again walk alone. The fire crackled, the stars wheeled above, and in the silence of the plains, Where once only the howl of wolves had echoed, there now rose a softer sound, the steady breathing of companions who would never leave. Not wolves, not yet the dogs of today, but something eternal, the first dogs, and their story had only just begun. The years passed, and with them generations of both people and wolves transformed into something neither could have foreseen. The fires that once flickered on open plains now glowed inside, shelters built of wood and stone. The hunts that once stretched for days across frozen rivers became quicker, sharper, shaped not only by human cunning, but by the four-legged companions who trotted at their side. The first dogs, though no one yet used the word, were no longer strangers to the tribe. They were as familiar as the faces of children, as constant as the turning of the moon. Where humans went, they went. Where wolves once prowled the edges of fear, dogs now walked confidently through the heart of the camp. The echo of their paw prints was everywhere. On riverbanks, hunters followed tracks pressed deep into the mud, knowing their companions had already scented the path of reindeer or elk. In forests, dogs barked sharply, driving small game from underbrush, their voices guiding hunters' spears. In the stillness of night, mothers rested easier, for they knew the dogs would growl at the first sign of danger. The rhythm of life was no longer human alone. It was a duet, a weaving of two paths into one. It was not always easy. Some dogs remained restless, their blood too wild for the steady circle of fire. They would vanish into the dark, drawn back to the howl of their kin, leaving only silence behind. Some grew too bold, snapping over scraps or challenging the hunters themselves, and were driven away. But for each one lost, there were others who stayed, their loyalty unshaken, their presence an anchor in the ever-shifting wilderness. Among the tribe, stories grew. Elders told of the great hunt, when wolves and men brought down beasts larger than either could face alone. Mothers told of the night a child was saved by a guardian's warmth. Shamans painted on stone not just animals and humans, but both together, shapes intertwined, paw prints pressed beside handprints as if carved by fate itself. The bond was no longer survival alone, it had become memory, tradition, myth. The children of that age would grow not remembering a time before dogs. They would not know the long nights when glowing eyes at the edge of the fire meant only fear. They would not recall the tense standoffs, the uncertain trust. For them, dogs were family, companions, a truth as natural as sunrise. And yet, echoes of the old wilderness remained. At times in the deep of winter, the dogs would lift their muzzles and howl. The sound was raw, ancient, filled with longing for the wild places they had left behind. The humans would sit in silence, listening, their own hearts stirred by memories older than their lives. They did not stop the howls, they let them rise into the cold air, a reminder that though the bond was strong, it had been forged from wildness. One evening, under a sky heavy with stars, a shaman spoke softly to the gathered tribe. "We did not tame them," she said, her voice low, "nor did they tame us. We walked together, and in walking we changed. They are not wolves, and we are no longer only men. Together we are something new." Her words sank deep into the hearts of her people, and though they could not yet know the truth of history, they felt it. The bond was not the bending of one will to another, it was the weaving of two destinies, the echoes of paw prints carried forward, across rivers, across plains, across generations. A boy grew into a hunter, his dog always at his side. Together they faced bears in the forest, together they crossed mountains, together they grew gray. When the hunter's time came to an end, it was said the dog lay beside him, refusing to leave until both their breaths had stilled. Their footprints, pressed side by side into the earth, told a story more enduring than words. The people carried that story, and others like it, in their songs and their paintings, in their whispered prayers to the spirits. They carried it forward, so that each new child would grow not only with firelight and stone, but with the steady gaze of eyes that reflected both wildness and love. The echoes of paw prints became part of the rhythm of the world, and though the Ice Age still gripped the land, though hardship and hunger were never far, the people no longer felt truly alone. For wherever they went, wherever they wandered, the paw prints followed. Through snow, through mud, through dust and grass, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, sometimes pressed directly beside their own. In time no one could imagine life without them. The humans had changed, The wolves had changed, and together they had reshaped the very essence of survival. The echo of paw prints was no longer only sound or mark. It was story, it was kinship, it was the promise that no journey would ever again be walked in solitude. The fire burned low, its embers glowing like stars fallen to earth. Around it the tribe gathered in silence, their faces carved by shadow and flame. Beyond the circle of warmth stretched the vast unknown, the plains rolling endlessly into night, forests murmuring with unseen lives, rivers whispering songs older than memory. And always, just beyond the reach of the firelight, the eyes of companions shone. Dogs who had once been wolves, guardians who had chosen to stay. It had been many lifetimes since the first wolf dared approach the hunters. Many winters since hungry pups lingered by the glow of fire, yet even now the memory was alive, carried not in words alone, but in the rhythm of shared footsteps, in the breath of dogs lying beside their people. The tribe no longer thought of them as outsiders. Dogs were woven into the fabric of life, as much a part of the camp as stone tools or tanned hides. When hunters rose at dawn, dogs rose with them. When children played in the dust, dogs leapt and tumbled by their side. When the sick groaned in shelters, dogs lay close, lending their warmth as silent comfort. The firelight no longer belonged to humans alone. It was shared. But beyond the firelight, the wild still called. At night, when the moon rose silver over the horizon, dogs lifted their muzzles and howled. Their voices echoed through valleys, a bridge between what had been and what was becoming. Humans listened, hearts stirred by the sound, reminded that the bond was not conquest but kinship. For though dogs lived within the camp, a part of their souls still belonged to the wilderness. The people began to see this not as conflict, but as gift. Dogs carried two worlds within them, the firelight of humans, the shadow of the wild, and in walking beside them, humans too walked between worlds, creatures of spirit and soil, of instinct and story. Together they were something neither could have been alone. Stories told by elders grew more intricate. Dogs were said to guide hunters' spirits after death, leading them through the darkness toward the warmth of eternal fire. They were protectors in life, and guardians in the journey beyond. On cave walls, figures of men and dogs were painted not as separate, but as one, shapes leaning into each other, footprints and paw prints intertwined. Time moved forward, and the bond deepened. In distant valleys, tribes unknown to one another shared the same truth. Where humans lived, so too lived dogs. Across frozen tundras, across dense forests, across plains where mammoths still roamed, the pattern repeated. Paw prints beside footprints, firelight shared. Some dogs grew fierce, bred for strength and courage to face predators. Others grew swift, their slender forms chasing hares across open land. Some remained close to children, gentle and watchful, protectors of innocence. Diversity bloomed, shaped by the choices of humans, shaped by the choices of dogs themselves. What had begun as accident had become destiny. Yet for all their differences, all dogs carried the same spark, the echo of that first choice, the decision to step beyond fear and into firelight. The shamans spoke of it as covenant, not one written in words but in blood, in breath, in shared survival. Humans gave food, fire, and protection. Dogs gave loyalty, strength, and love. Both gave trust, and in that trust was born a bond that would outlast glaciers, outlast stone, outlast even the great beasts of the Ice Age. One evening, as snow fell thick and heavy, a child asked her grandmother why dogs stayed when wolves did not. The elder smiled, her eyes reflecting fire, because once long ago they chose us, and we chose them, and when choices are made with the heart, they echo forever. Her words drifted into the silence, carried by sparks rising toward the stars. The child curled against her dog, and together they slept, safe within the circle of fire. Beyond the firelight, the wild still waited. The wolves howled, the forests breathed, the rivers sang. But within the firelight, something eternal had been forged. The humans would change. Their shelters would grow into villages, their villages into cities. Their tools of stone would give way to bronze and iron, their songs to words etched in clay and ink. But through it all, dogs would remain. They would guard the gates of cities, as they once guarded the edges of camps. They would lie at the feet of kings as they once lay beside hunters. They would comfort children in huts of wood and palaces of stone, just as they had under skins stretched across poles. And still, on quiet nights, They would lift their voices in howls, remembering the wilderness that birthed them, carrying within them the echo of wolves. Beyond the firelight, the story continued. The paw prints pressed beside footprints would stretch across continents, across centuries, across civilizations yet unborn. The bond would grow, shifting, adapting, yet never breaking. The covenant of trust, of loyalty, of love, would remain. And though the people of 30,000 years ago could not have known, though they sat only with their fire and their stone and their faithful dogs, they had shaped the future of the world, for from that moment on, humans would never again walk alone, not beyond the firelight, not into the unknown, not into tomorrow. Always beside them, the steady echo of paw prints,